Vice President of any kind at WVU and was Associate Vice President of Rural Health at the Health Sciences Center here at WVU for 18 years. She spent the last 8 years working with rural and homeless veterans. She's the niece of Bonnie G. Holmes, who is secretary for Dr. Wernher von Braun for 18 years, and today she's going to tell us about her aunt, who's been called the Superglue of Apollo.
Thank you all very much. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good. Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be able to do this, to talk about my family and my family's involvement in the early days of NASA and in the space industry, and there's quite a few of them. I'm originally from a farming community, a cotton farming community in North Alabama, but I've lived in West Virginia for 45 years. So I want to thank you all, and I've got my family and my friends with me. I got my own little cheering section over here and one over here, and so I'm really thrilled to do this, and I want to thank my husband who just walked in, and Papa Z. And the first time that my husband Dennis met my Aunt Bonnie, it was such a profound experience for him. I saw him teared up. He denies that he did, but he said it was just like talking to living history when he was able to talk with her. And I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to spend just a very few years with her before she passed away. So the Superglue of Apollo actually is a quote by Dr. Marguerite von Braun, who is Dr. von Braun's middle child. And she made that quote in 2012 when we were with my aunt at von Braun's 100th birthday celebration in Huntsville. And she said that there were two women that made it possible for Dr. von Braun to make it to the moon. One was her mother. She told beautiful stories of her mother. And she said, and the other was Bonnie Holmes, who was his personal assistant. And she stood up. She had Bonnie stand. And then my aunt received a standing ovation by the 300 people that were in that room. So we were all very, very proud of her. Before I get into talking about my family, I always want to make sure that everybody knows West Virginia's connections to the space industry also. And we are fortunate to have 5 living legends of people that were in the space industry. And of course, most people do know about Katherine Johnson. She's been in the news a lot, certainly after the Hidden Figures movie came out. And there will be a talk at 7 p.m. tonight about her. The other person, it's Chuck Yeager. I'm sure some of you know about Chuck Yeager. He was the first person to break the sound barrier in 1947, but he was also the first trainer of the first group of astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, when the space program started, before NASA. And then Homer Hickam is from Coalwood, West Virginia, and he mostly is known as an author, but he's also an aerospace engineer. And he and his wife do live in Huntsville, and Jake Gyllenhaal portrayed him in that movie. And then this person you probably don't know, but he's a personal family friend. His name is Ed Buckby. He's from Romney, West Virginia. He's a graduate of WVU with a degree in journalism, and he served as the first press agent for NASA and for Dr. von Braun in the early years of NASA. And then he eventually started Space Camp. You've heard of Space Camp? With my aunt and with that was Dr. von Braun's idea. And then he also has written a number of books. His latest book is called The Real Space Cowboys. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And he lives in Huntsville with his wife and his family. And then John McBride, who's the youngest, but he at the age of 75 is still a little bit older than me. But he was the pilot of one of the space shuttle missions in 1984, and he's a West Virginian from Charleston. So before I get started with the information about the early development of the space industry, I just wanted to acknowledge that I have other family members still working for NASA, still in the space industry in Huntsville, Alabama. And I have an uncle who actually created the crystal growth experiment that was going on at the space station. He actually designed and built the machinery that would do that experiment, and had to go train the astronauts that were going on the space shuttle on actually how to assemble and reassemble that. And that same uncle was a precision machinist in the early days of both the Mercury and Apollo. And then another aunt who is a civil service person, and she worked for program management and actually was involved when they were dismantling the Redstone program and using some of the Redstone parts then to advance to other rocket systems. Currently, I have two cousins that are working in the industry. One of those cousins actually was involved in designing or looking at Russian space engines, to figure out what components, because their nozzle systems were superior to ours. And so he was involved in trying to figure out why they were superior. And this was after '84, after the fall, of course, of the USSR, and they were more accessible. And then my dad. My dad worked for Chrysler Corporation, and Chrysler was a contractor. And the Chrysler Corporation actually had a contract with the Army to build the Jupiter missiles. And my dad was working on the Jupiter, which was the rocket that put the chimpanzees into space. And he worked on the Redstone also. And so the first rocket that actually was used to try and put a human into space was a modification. The Jupiter C was a modification of the Redstone missile. So when my dad, in '58, when NASA started, my dad was given the opportunity to take a new job, and he chose to leave the space program and go into the weapon missile system because they were paying a lot more money. And by this time in his life, he had 6 children. And so that's how we wound up moving to El Paso, Texas in 1958.
When I was 17 years old, I had no doubt that man would land on the moon in my lifetime. But of course, at the age of 17, I had no idea what it would really take to do it, nor did I know what $1 billion was. Although he wanted to explore space, he was under contract to the United States Army to begin developing the Army's stable of missiles for defense. In 1958, von Braun's team of Germans and Americans launched Explorer 1, the free world's first satellite, propelling this country into space for the first time. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. was shocked when the Soviet Union launched a man into space. The von Braun team responded by launching Alan B. Shepard Jr., America's first astronaut, to the edge of space. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy committed us to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Frank Williams served as an assistant to von Braun in Huntsville and also worked closely with him on plans for future space travel at NASA headquarters in Washington.
Well, when that happened, von Braun it was like having a ton lifted off of his shoulders. I'm out of the military business. I'm back in civilian spaceflight. It's peaceful uses of outer space. That was a big load off of his and the rest of the teams, because there was a stigma there, which I found out about later. But you could tell there was a big point in his life.
It would take a rocket of immense size, power, and accuracy to launch men to the moon. Von Braun will become the father of the moon rocket, the world's largest and most powerful rocket, the Saturn V.
And when he came back, walked in the office with a big grin on his face and said, "Mission accomplished."
One of the greatest, if not the greatest highlight. But I must say I was just as happy when he went back home, because during these early Apollo flights, you just walk around with a lump in your throat, for a couple of days.
I wanted to include this. This is Dr. von Braun's handwriting, and I actually fortunate to have this a copy of this document. Everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death. And even as a scientist, he never saw any conflict between his own spiritual beliefs and his science. And he was, of course, an outstanding scientist. And the primary reason he gives, and gave very early on, for deciding to join with and come to the United States was because of our freedom of religion. And he wanted his science to be advanced for peaceful purposes in an exploration rather than weaponry, which is what he had been doing for Hitler when he was in Germany. So those of us in the family that talk about Bonnie's experiences and some of her stories say that she just went from the cotton patch to the moon because as she grew up in a farming family, and she'd do her chores in the morning before she went to school. She was a pioneer. She had children. She was married. She was a very devoted daughter to my grandparents. She was born in 1930 in Lacey Springs, Alabama, which is a very small rural community. And she graduated from Eva High School in 1945 at the age of 16 because she was so smart that her teachers advanced her 2 different grades while she was in grade school. She graduated from Andrew Jackson Business University in Nashville in '48. And one of my favorite stories about her was in 1952 when she was interviewed for the job to work for the scientists who had been brought to the United States through Mexico and put in Huntsville, Alabama. And there were a number of people. A call went out just for women in the steno pool to take a typing test. So she took the typing test and she scored the second highest of all of the people that had taken the test. And so she was called for an interview. And this car drove up and she got a special car to come pick her up from work and take her to the interview. And when she got into the car, she said that there was this older woman who had on gloves and a hat, was well dressed, and she remembers thinking, how could I ever compete with this woman for this particular job? And so she was worried that she wouldn't get the job because she was so young. In 1952, she was a divorced mother of a 2-year-old. And she didn't have a lot of role models of women who established a career, and there were not a lot of options for very intelligent women in that time period. And so while she could have herself been an engineer, she had very limited options given the culture that she was brought up in. So when she went for this interview, her boss, she at that time was working for the Army's Ballistic Missile Agency, and that clip that we saw earlier, Frank Williams, when he said something about the stigma was because these gentlemen who were working with the space program had been part of in Germany, were part of the Nazis. And that was a huge problem for them. They had a lot of trouble being accepted by the other American engineers in the missile program because of their previous affiliations. But anyway, so her boss said to her, you really don't want to go for that interview and get that job. And she said, well, I'm interested, I'd like to. And he said, no, you don't. You don't want to do that. And she said, well, why? And she said, because those crazy krauts think we're going to the moon. And she said, I know, and that sounds exciting to me, and I want to be part of it. And so she had read a lot of the issues of Collier magazine that covered a lot of space in the early 50s, and she had known who von Braun was, and she was very intrigued by all of this and did everything she could to become a part of it. Her first job was working at Redstone Arsenal in that ballistic agency I was talking about. And then she stayed throughout the agency's move from being part of the Army to being in the Civilian Space Council, and then ultimately being part of NASA. And she was impeccable in her organizational skills. She would have comments from nobility, from celebrities. Anybody that came to visit Dr. von Braun would make comments about how well organized she was. She was always entertaining them and, handling all of their logistics and so forth for their visits. And so she met people like some of the most frequent people that Dr. von Braun had contact with during that time was President Kennedy. She became a personal friend with Evelyn Lincoln, who was President Kennedy's secretary, and Walt Disney, Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, a number of authors. She was always supplying information to people who were writing books, but nobody's ever written a book about her. And so she's part of that. She's one of the very unsung heroes among the unsung heroes. And so she was one of the first aerospace secretaries, because it was an entire job class that was started in those years. I wanted to use this picture because it really represents her being in the middle of both of these bosses. One was with the Army and the other was with the development of NASA. And so General Medeiros, who after he retired became a priest, she still had contact with him up until their deaths. And Dr. von Braun, she stayed with him for 18 years, but her job title went from secretary to executive secretary, personal assistant. One of the things that in her role that she had to do was to attend a lot of technical meetings with Dr. von Braun and the other scientists, and she took shorthand. Who here knows what shorthand is? Okay. The older people in the crowd. Well, this was long before computers and long before laptops, and even handheld recording devices were not that common. And so she took shorthand, and every time they were developing some of their science, they had to come up with a word to describe it. And so she took shorthand on naming this word and then describing it, and then her job was to go train all of the other secretaries that worked for the other scientists on what these words were and what they meant. And we still have, our family still has her steno pads with these terms written in each one of her steno pads. One of the things that she did was she nominated Dr. von Braun for Boss of the Year in the International Boss of the Year, and he won. And so there was a big to-do about that, and he gave speeches, and she had to plan a big dinner for that, and that was one of the things that she was really, really excited about. And then she herself became the National Secretary of the Year in 1968. And there was a spread in Glamour magazine of her and Dr. von Braun in the early, in 61, and then this one was in 1968. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the picture that appeared in Glamour magazine in 1961.
Who was this man, von Braun? Rocket scientist, visionary, space advocate, crusader for space. To learn more about him, we talked with the men and women who worked closely with von Braun during this exciting time for the race to the moon.
He could make anyone feel at ease.
Bonnie Holmes was von Braun's secretary while working for the Army and NASA in Huntsville.
Everyone who worked for him, I think, admired him and respected him because he treated everyone as a real person.
One of the important days in von Braun's early NASA career was the visit of President John F. Kennedy to Huntsville in 1962. It was huge for von Braun and the Huntsville team. He had advised the president to challenge the nation to send men to the moon and defeat the Russians in an all-out race to the moon.
Well, he accepted it very well and wanted to go ahead and get started, get things going. And he was very happy that the president made that decision.
The young president learned on this trip that if this country was going to the moon, that journey would start in Huntsville, Alabama.
This is a picture, the top picture of Bonnie at her desk, and you can see what tiny little space she had to work in, and his office was huge. And then this is another picture of her and some of the other secretaries at Cape Canaveral for a launch. And part of their job description was literally to go to the launches, and her job was to take care of the astronauts' families that were there attending the launch. And some of the astronaut families decided, you know, if their astronaut was being shot off into space, some of them chose to stay home, others of them went to the Cape to actually watch it. And if they chose to go to the Cape, then her job was to just try to make everybody as comfortable as possible, and to give activities for the children and make sure the children were there. And of course, you know, back in everybody's mind was always this idea and the reality that things could go wrong. And if things were to go wrong, their family members were present. So that was, she told me one time, that was one of the most challenging things of her career, was just knowing that that could happen. I included this picture because of what had to happen. You can see the scale models were built of every one of the rockets that the rocket team that they developed in Huntsville. So starting way back with the Jupiter and the Explorer, which was after the U-2 rocket, that was the German rocket, all the way up to the Saturn. And in order to keep the rockets in scale, the Saturn was so huge they had to cut a hole in the ceiling in his office, in order for them to stay in proportion. And I can remember going with my father on one of our return trips from El Paso, Texas, to go see her, to visit with my aunt and see if she could go to lunch with us. And during that trip, Dr. von Braun and another gentleman came out, and the other gentleman looked familiar to me, but I wasn't sure who it was. And she introduced me to him and my dad, and then she took us in to look at the ceiling. So she talked about what all they had to do. And then we got in the car. She was too busy to go, and we got in the car, and my dad said, "Well, what did you think about meeting?" And he named him. And I said, "Well, yeah, it's okay." And he said, "You don't realize who that was." And I said, "Well, who was it?" And he said, "Well, it was only the first American in space. You just met Alan Shepard." And so I was young enough to not realize what was going on. The person who was narrating those video clips that I used is Ed Buckby, you know, one of our famous West Virginians. And he developed in 2008, he has a DVD called The Rocket Man. I highly recommend it. You can get the different parts of it on YouTube. And one of the things that was so good about Ed was making sure that everybody got noted. And he was very conscientious and very aware of the amount of support that was required, not only of other engineers, but all of the secretarial and clerical staff and the publicity staff for these engineers to do their job. And so he included segments in his DVD of the three women that you see in this picture. Bonnie, of course, was his secretary in Huntsville, and the woman in the middle, Dorette Schlitz, was his secretary when he was at Peenemünde in Germany. And then Ruth von Schirmer is actually the wife of one of the 118 scientists that defected and came to the U.S., and she was the translator. And she had technical knowledge so that she was able to not only just translate conversations, she actually translated some of the documents that were written in German by some of the scientists into English. And so von Braun was really the first rocket man. Now, nothing to disparage Elton John, but he was called Rocket Man before that song was even out. And these are two letters. I like to include these. These are in my possession also, and these are letters from Dr. von Braun singing my aunt's praises and clearly indicate how much he depended on her and her support. One of the things that happened as the decade of the 60s advanced and we had more and more success in the Apollo mission, it got increasingly harder for Dr. von Braun to travel and not be thronged with lots of people because he was so well known. And even when they traveled internationally, you know, reporters and would hound their family and take their pictures and all that stuff. And so one of the things she started doing every time she made travel arrangements for them, she made them in her own name, her and her husband's name. Now her husband, who was also my first cousin on the other side of the family, he rarely left the farm. So there's no way he would have ever gone to Switzerland, but she would use her name in order to try and protect the anonymity of the von Braun family as much as possible. And I wanted to wrap up with this very personal experience that we had very recently, just before my aunt died. My husband Dennis and I got married in 2014, and one of the things that my sons and my daughter-in-law and my sister and I had started doing in 2018 was to start cataloging all of her memorabilia. And so during the course of that work that took us a number of trips to Alabama to do, she showed me and talked to me about this bracelet. This was a bracelet that Dr. von Braun and his wife Maria had bought her as a souvenir on one of their trips to Thailand. And so I asked her if during my wedding I could use that as my something borrowed. And so she put it on me, and she said certainly, you know, she brought it with her, but then she said she wanted it to be my wedding gift, so she actually gave it to me. So this, I don't have the year, but it had to have been sometime in the 50s that the von Brauns bought this for Bonnie. She has many, many gifts that have now been inherited to and given to her granddaughters and her grandchildren of things that she was given. One of the things that they actually found after she had died that none of us knew about was a silver bowl that Dr. von Braun had engraved and gave to her following Apollo 11. And the engravement says, "Thank you so much for helping us get to the moon." And so that silver bowl is, my cousin has that now. So there's all kinds of stories that I can tell, and I wanted to acknowledge my family members that helped with this, and my sons, of course, Jesse and Eli Heady, and my daughter-in-law Megan Heady, who are here with us, that helped us gather this material and learn these stories and try to capture them in some way. And so this, my aunt, Jake Sturdivant, is one of the individuals who's retired now, but was part of the U.S. Army. She was the civil servant I was telling you about that worked there. And Ray Cheatham is her son. And Ed Buckby has been a tremendous help to us in terms of us trying to keep alive the memories and the work of my Aunt Bonnie. So thank you all very much, and I'm open for questions.
Questions? About the moon
Nothing.
landing, or about Bonnie, or some of the work she did? Yeah.
What was it like gender-wise for her?
For gender-wise? Well, you know, in the 50s, I mean, she was in a female-dominated occupation. So, I mean, it wasn't like she had to really fight for her job and face any gender discrimination because of that. Because most women that had jobs, they were either secretaries or nurses, or teachers, and that was about it. But I'm certain it was a different story for women who were engineers, who were educated, who were of color. That's a whole different ballgame. But she never really talked that much about it. But part of that was because in those years, I mean, I know my grandmother, I know her mother, and my grandmother was very supportive of women working outside the home. She thought it was a fantastic idea. She even did that herself during World War II, working in munitions in Huntsville. But her belief system meant that you still did all of the stuff that women always did. You know, you did all the cleaning, all the cooking, all the laundry, you took care of the babies, you did all of that, but then you did your job. So this whole notion of balance didn't exist in the 50s. And so Bonnie was like that. I mean, she trained her son and my brother lived with her for a while, but so she trained them how to get dinner ready and how to do it up to a certain point so that if she was going to be late, they could still eat. And her husband, my uncle cousin Junior, he was a very traditional man and he expected his dinner, you know. And so she had to figure out how to do that and still live in that world, still uphold the mores and the values of a traditional homebound woman and eke out her career and excel at that. And fortunately, she excelled at both. She was a tremendous inspiration for all of the women in my family. Thank you for that question. Yes, ma'am.
So she lived in Huntsville and worked in Huntsville.
Well, she lived in a little town called Eva, Alabama. It's about a 45-minute drive from Huntsville.
Okay, but so she would go to Florida whenever they would have.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was she ever able to meet any of the human computers, so to speak?
Well, you know, I wish that she had still been alive when that movie came out because I had that same question. I wanted to know that myself. She probably knew of them, but whether or not she met them, I don't know, because they worked in Langley. You know, they were in Virginia, which was the other, you know, there were major installations throughout the country. There were California, Texas, Alabama, and Virginia. And so chances are she didn't meet them, but she probably knew about them.
So it's probably not true that Katherine Johnson was at the launch.
Oh yeah, that would have been true.
Okay.
That would have been true. Yeah. Oh yeah. They probably flew her down there because they had. I mean, there were certain people that had job duties during launches, and she had job duties during launches. So that's why she flew to the Cape. My uncle cousin Junior never went. He never went with her. Did you have a question?
I did. So when you were young and all of this is happening, were you aware of what a big deal it was, or was it, oh yeah, they just can't body
Yes, and part of that had to do with being young, but the other part of it had to do with being a rural person in my rural family. And you know, one of the biggest sins you can do as a rural person is be pretentious about who you are. And so, you know, she valued people for who they were, not what their accomplishments were. And so I grew up believing and knowing that. And so I honestly did not begin to develop my own awareness of the significance that my family had in the space industry and in NASA until I was a late teenager and until I actually came to West Virginia as a VISTA volunteer in 1968. And I was here during the lunar landing and saw it on the black and white TV like everybody else here in West Virginia saw it. And that was when it really became significant. So I had met Alan Shepard, didn't even know who he was, but I did meet Frank Borman some years later, and I did know who he was. Thank goodness, I knew about that. But I met him before his Apollo mission, which was Apollo 8, and I don't know if you all remember that, but that was 1968, December, just before Christmas, when they read Genesis from their orbit. And that was his idea, Frank Borman's idea, to read Genesis. And so that I do remember because it was significant to me because I had met him. Yes, Milo.
How is the rocket made?
How is the rocket made? Oh, Lordy. Well, I don't think we have enough time to talk about that, but you know what? There's a lot of stuff we can give you and we can read with you to find it. But one of the things that is important for you to know is that building the rockets got much more complicated the closer we got to sending a human being into space, because the original rockets that were made were all one piece. And then all of the other rockets became in stages. And the reason they all had to have different stages was because they all had to do different functions. So when you see some of the films and you see the rocket taking off and then you see smoke and gas and fire coming out, that's another piece of the rocket that's coming down because that piece is not needed anymore. So the Saturn V, the reason they had to build that huge rocket with those huge engines, and one of those engines would be about the size of half of this room, is how big they are. And there were 5 of them because they had so many different stages on that rocket because they had to go to the moon. And in order to go to the moon, they had to get out of Earth's atmosphere. They had to have enough boosters to then get to the moon's orbit. They had to have another booster to get them to go around the moon. And then they had to have 2 pieces of spaceship that would help them land and get back up. And so one of the astronauts was in what they call the command module, and that was Michael Collins. And so all he did was he just circled the moon. But once they got into the lunar orbit, what they called the limb or the eagle, it was the nickname of it was Eagle. It completely separated from the command module and then on its own was guided and went down to the moon. And Neil Armstrong actually had to drive it. He had to fly it because the original spot they were going to land had big boulders in it and he was afraid to land in it. So that was one stage of the rocket, was just what they called the lunar module. They called it the Eagle, and that's why he said, Houston, the Eagle has landed. And then they had another little section that they had to get in to go back up and meet Mike Collins, who was circling the moon, and so they left, the Eagle is still on the moon. It's just still sitting there. And so then they had to go up, and then they had to dock, and they actually had to dock into a spot. The 2 pieces of spaceship had to hit a circle about this big. And so it was a miracle. To me, it's a miracle that they did all that. They were able to do it. And then they came back home and were safe.
So we have time for maybe one more question.
So since your family was like all associated with all the like space race and everything, did it ever, did you ever want to like go into that field as well?
Well, you know, it's very interesting that's a good question because those of you who didn't live through the 60s, especially 1968, was a tumultuous time in our country. Probably more divisive than, well, the last time it was that divisive was during the Civil War. And I went into the field of social work. And among my peers, people didn't even want me to talk about my family's involvement in space because to them, it was too much money that they were spending on space exploration when we could be using that money for other things. I believed that, but I also believed we could prioritize things in this country, which we've honestly never done a good job of, and we still aren't doing a good job of that. And so my leanings were to go into social work, and I was offered a scholarship to come here to West Virginia University to get my degree in social work. And so people that were really into the space exploration and supported it were really supporting it because they saw peaceful applications. They really felt like it would bring humanity back together, that it would somehow heal a lot. And in 1968, for that brief moment, in 1969, that's exactly what happened. Those few days that those guys were up there in 1969, the whole world was together. That's a good question. Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was interested in a statement you made early on about how she could have been an engineer had the times been different. Did you ever have any discussions with her about that and things that she wonders what if, or was she very satisfied with
She,
the successful?
well, she was extremely satisfied with her career in her life, just like I am, and she felt like she had wonderful opportunities to do the things that she did. She actually spoke, she actually trained the next generation of aerospace secretaries. She started the different, and she was one of the people that was instrumental in starting the National Secretaries Association across the country. And so to her, that was very worthy work. She had people, her guidance counselor in high school, when she said she wanted to go to Andrew Jackson to go to secretarial school, he said, "You are too smart to be a secretary. You should not do that because secretaries have a bad name because they sit on their boss's laps." So, and so she had a lot of negative advice to not do what she did, but she wanted to do it. And she felt like she was close enough to that activity and close enough to that excitement that, you know, that was that for her. And I mean, she never told me that she wanted to do or be anything different, but I also knew my uncle, cousin, Junior. And I don't know how all of that would have worked out.
All right, I think we're just about out of time, unfortunately, but thank you all for coming, and let's give Hilda another round of applause. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much, and I